So, welcome everybody to our first parallel session this Sunday afternoon or morning, depending on where we are. And I'm very excited to have three distinguished guests here today. So they're all from an organization called Perspectiva. And on the website, it says that Perspectiva is a community of expert generalists working on an urgent 100-year project to improve the relationships between systems, souls, and society in theory and practice. So that's very appealing. It was co-founded by Jonathan, who we have here, and Thomas, who was here yesterday. And Zach Stein, who was also a speaker yesterday. He's also part of the organization. And yeah, really excited to hand over to Jonathan, Mark, and Pippa to guide us through this 1 hour together. And yeah, let's see what happens.
Okay, thanks. We're on. Thanks, Niklas. Much appreciated. And it's a great pleasure to be with the wider European Bildung community and those beaming in from outside of Europe as well. So this morning's a chance to sort of do a few different things for us. It's to sort of reconnect with the Bildung crowd, I suppose, and sort of welcome being part of the broader family. It's a chance to clarify our purpose on one particular way we're trying to bring Bildung to bear in practice. And it's maybe a chance to sort of begin to connect some of the theoretical work that I personally have been doing with my role as as the director of the organization to make sense of why we're doing what we're doing. So I'll try and make that. I'm going to share some slides to make sense of all that and run through it. It's quite conceptually demanding in some ways, but I'd ask you to bear with that, even if it's sort of not quite 7 a.m. in Canada. It's commensurate with the gravity of purpose to which I think Bildung is called to respond. So let's have a look. I'll just share my screen in a moment and go here. And what's happening there? Why is that not coming? Here we go, share. Right, so, and then we'll go from the start. Thank you, okay. So can you all see that? Okay, great. So this talk has a somewhat, well, ambitious title, The Post-Conventional Imperative. I'm going to speak about Bildung, but actually it's something more about how we want to make use of Bildung in the UK context at a particular festival and to speak to the broader story of that. And the heart of what I want to speak about are four main sort of dispositions or sensibilities or attitudes or even atmospheres that we hope will characterize the festival we're putting on, and which we feel are sort of a necessary part of 21st century Bildung. And I'll go into more detail later, but just so you know what's coming, we're speaking about the post-tragic, the post-rational, post-growth, and post-tribal. And when I say post in all of those contexts, I'm talking about transcending and including rather than just rejecting or going against. Okay, so that's kind of what's coming. That's a brief overview of the Realisation Festival, the Eros statue or anti-Eros statue, which Mark can speak to in more depth later maybe. But the festival is held in Dorset, a beautiful country home called St Giles House that's been the home of the Earl of Shaftesbury for many centuries. And the pattern that connected Perspectiva and the third Earl, the third Earl historically and the 12th Earl in the present day called Nick, is Bildung, which was not, and we didn't see that coming, we didn't plan for it, but I was invited to meet the third Earl, the 12th Earl, I keep saying the third Earl, Nick, by a common friend, a common associate, who noticed that Nick wanted to put on a festival about philosophy and thought that Perspectiva might have some ideas of how to help them. And we met and we had talked around, kicked the ball around quite a bit. And only afterwards, when I'd left and I called up Thomas Bjorkman, whom you mentioned, Nicholas, already, and said, yeah, I met today the Earl of Shaftesbury and they're interested in putting on a festival. We might be able to help. And he said, oh, the Earl of Shaftesbury is mentioned in our book, The Nordic Secret, because he was a very key early thinker on Bildung. So this is how the sort of pattern began to connect. But over time, of course, we ran into trouble with this word Bildung. As we tried to promote the festival and speak around it, we decided to change the name. The Bildung Festival didn't quite work in English as an invitation. Realisation, we can come back to maybe in questions, but we think that it might be one of the better translations of Bildung in English in a single word. So let me just put this down so I can see. Okay, right. So this is just to get clear. Although we're chatting on a Sunday and it's a friendly and not apparently very, very serious atmosphere, it is worth saying that Bildung is not a nice to have. It's very much sort of existential survival for me. I don't see the conversation around transformative civic education or becoming who we have to be as some kind of nice to have, neat, niche conceptual notion. I see it as absolutely the heart of the matter, the path quality, the way we have to respond, what we're called upon to do and be. And this quotation by Thomas Metzinger I often wield just as a way of focusing the mind. Now, the problem, as we'll see in a moment, is not just climate collapse, not just ecological even, but that really focuses the mind. We really might be stupid enough to destroy our only viable home as a species. And we seem to be unable to stop ourselves. It's not to say we necessarily will be, we don't give up, we don't say it's hopeless, but several decades into this problem, we seem to be unable to mobilize a commensurate response. We are trapped in ways of being and doing and thinking that seem to be leading us inexorably to a kind of ecological collapse. Now, Metzinger's point is the challenge exceeds our present cognitive and emotional abilities. So that begs the question in the context of Bildung, well, what are those abilities and what do we know about how to develop them? And it's not just a kind of nice to have. Like I say, it's the survival of a viable civilization that's at stake. We have to sort of change fundamentally, transform even. Do we know how to do that? It's not so clear. Oh, here we go. Right. Just to reassure the sort of more conventional Bildungites here, we're speaking about realization and various other forms of post-conventional sensibility. But I personally have written about Bildung as a notion at least twice. There was an essay I did for the sort of university affiliation I have at the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity in Surrey. And I also, as part of my Open Rights Fellowship, Open Society Fellowship, wrote about the importance of Bildung as a sort of way of reconceiving what human rights are, human rights becoming human capabilities and developing human capabilities through a process of transformative civic education. So I'm very much involved in the kind of theoretical case for Bildung. And as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Bjorkman's a close colleague. I know Lenny Rachel Anderson quite well, and been working with Zach Stein over the last few years. So although what I'm about to say looks a little bit different from Bildung, I want those who care about Bildung and the broader Bildung community to know that it's very much grounded in that understanding. So it is Bildung, but as they say in Star Trek, not quite as we know it. I won't spend too long on this, other than to say, what's going on broadly conceived. If I could try and say what is Bildung responding to, and what is the festival as a manifestation of Bildung responding to, it's something like the meta crisis. And there's a whole theoretical conversation there about what the meta crisis might mean. But the way to think of it is like this. If COVID says to us, look at our interdependence, look at our fragility, look at what we're all caught up in, look at the life we've been living and the bio-precarity it creates, look at all of the ways that we are vulnerable together, look at how the best self comes out when you're asked to collaborate and cooperate. look at the ways that we're called upon to be different at a time of crisis and how it brings to mind what really matters, right? That's what COVID does. It's a kind of reckoning. But alongside that, there's still this absolutely raging emergency. I mean, people, when they say there's a climate emergency, they're not wrong. There is a time-sensitive urgency to change the way we live. And all that that means politically, economically, institutionally, and so forth. And the climate emergency says, look, do something, act now. And a lot of the talks I give, people say all this philosophical stuff, forget it, we don't have time. But the reason that you don't have a choice is that the emergency is a limited notion to help you understand how to act. Emergency says act, it doesn't tell you how. Because alongside the reckoning and the emergency, there's a kind of crisis of governance. And that crisis of governance is one that prevents us from acting at speed and scale in the way we have to. So the political and economic crisis says, change, things like change the system, transform, regenerate, all of this language abounds. But then we get back to our desk, or we get back to our job, or we get back to our family, and we're like, okay, but who does that? How do they do that? And what are they bringing to bear, crucially? And this is where the meta crisis and the Bildung imperative comes in, with what sensibility and imagination. And that brings us to the invitation. I love this line by McIntyre. I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part? The pickle is part of that, what we call the pickle. And I've written a long essay to try and explain the pickle, but you don't even have to call it that. You just have to know that we're in this predicament that's very complex, that has many layers, that doesn't lend itself to simple solutions. A world of incommensurate values and competing commitments and power struggles. And, any vision of the future has to contend with all of that. It has to look deeply into those kind of struggles. And there are different ways of looking at that. One is that you fight the political battle somehow. But the other way of looking at it is that there's some kind of step change in our understanding is called for, some kind of conversion or metanoia or gestalt shift in which we look at the world entirely differently. And that's the story, I would say, that we now find ourselves part of. How do we make that transformation in perception at scale? And it ain't easy, but I think that's what we're caught up in. And this is what I call the post-conventional imperative. And a lot of words on the screen here, and I'll come to them separately, but just so you know what's coming. I think we have to get to the hope on the other side of despair. We have to get beyond naive solutionism. We have to get beyond the idea that everything's going to be okay, or that progress is proceeding as it should. I think it's time to take stock of the fact that the conventional way of living is not working. The belief in indefinite economic growth is not working. The belief that the intellect is sufficient to solve the world's problems is not working. Our capacity to collaborate is fatally undermined by latent forms of tribalism that are getting in the way of dealing with complex collective action problems. These are major challenges, and they're deep and embedded and encoded in the world as we find it. So the reason we speak of the post-conventional imperative is that convention is killing us in a sense. It has its strength. It's not like it has no value, and it's not to say everything's falling apart, but it's to look closely that as long as we think we can tinker our way to solutions, as long as we think that we can understand, for example, a world of hyperobjects and a world of AI and the algorithmic society, as long as we think the intellect is up to that, we'll still be deluded. As long as we think we can have indefinite growth on a finite planet and that we don't need a fundamentally different economic model, I think we're deluded. And as long as we think that our tribe, whether it be liberal or socialist or conservative or anything else, is the right tribe to win the battle, we're deluded. So we have to somehow move beyond all of these things. We have to get post-tragic, post-rational, post-growth, and post-tribal. Now, when I say post, as I said already, I don't mean to reject. I mean to get to the other side of, to transcend and include in some way. So we'll speak about that as we go. First of all, the post-tragic. Why should you talk about the tragic at all? It's funny, when you use this term post-tragic, some people, they see one side of the word and some see the other. Some see the tragedy and go, well, why do you bring tragedy into the equation? I don't need tragedy at my festival. What are you talking about? The others see the post and think, oh, it'd be nice to get beyond tragedy. So The way I see it is this: tragedy is there because mattering is there. The more things matter, the more scope there is for tragedy, right? And if you don't allow tragedy to be part of the story, you thin out life, you make life much too light. Light has its weight and depth and heaviness for a reason, because things really matter. If your loved one dies, you're crushed, your spirit is completely destroyed. If the world is on fire and your community is destroyed, it matters. COVID has been a kind of tragedy, a collective tragedy that we did not see coming. There are other tragedies to come. We are now deeply immersed in a kind of tragic state of affairs, which is not to say that we stay stuck there and depressed and despairing. It's to say that we have to somehow bring that with us and not pretend that it's not there. The world to come will be a post-tragic world, a world where we reckon with what's gone wrong. And if we don't, that we don't really have a chance to get beyond it. Post-growth is quite important, just because I think unless we get serious about the underlying economic drivers of our system, it's going to be very hard to change the game. My favorite thinker in this space is Tim Jackson. He's written a wonderful book by that title, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. And the challenge is to somehow to get into a framework where you speak about the economy that is not primarily driven by the macro scale, for economies to get bigger and bigger and people to buy more and more things based on a sense of dissatisfaction, which is perpetuated by advertising. We need an entirely different economic model where we're actually trying to live differently, fundamentally, and the social structure allows us to do that. And if we can't get there, I think we're going to be caught in delusion. Which is not to say there wouldn't be a place for targeted economic growth in particular places of development, in particular countries for a particular period of time. It's not a kind of entirely ideological position. It's much more about taking stock of where we are historically, which I think is consistent with Bildung. It's about what's called upon us now historically. And I think it needs to be post-rational. Again, not simply rejecting reason. I'm all for reason, I'm all for the intellect, but just recognizing there are limits, so that the reason we try out things at the festival, like improvisation or metaphor or constellations or the anti-debate, is because we believe that we need to push beyond the limits of the intellect. And for those who know sort of integral theory, this is trying to get not sort of pre-intellect, but somehow trans-intellect or post-intellect. Is trying to recognize that there are forms of intuition and insight that may not be fully encapsulated within reason as we know it. And then post-tribal. It's funny, this photo that was chosen does look a little bit tribal. It looks like a fairly bourgeois affair, but in principle, the idea of getting towards a post-tribal mentality is to recognize, look, you can't entirely shake off tribalism. We need our tribes in some way. We need our close collaborations, our bonding networks. We need to feel safe with people who will look after us and vice versa. And so it's not about rejecting the idea of tribes entirely, but we're looking for something like a post-tribal tribalism. And by that, I mean that we hold our tribes lightly and reflectively. We more freely engage with others. We don't expect to always agree. We don't expect to always have the same values, but nonetheless, we find a way of living in a shared world. So we're looking for a mature we, a we that's kind of worthy of the moment. So those four sensibilities or post-conventional ways of looking at things we feel imperative. They're things that we need to bring to bear. And I'm just going to go back a few slides so we can see them together. The question then becomes, well, what do you do? Like, how do you bring them to bear? And I think one of the reasons we're having this festival at St Giles in July, and hopefully every year thereafter, is that you need a shared experience. Where does it come from? Where does the desire to get into Bildung at scale come from? The desire to build institutions and frameworks and cultures and funding models and capacity. Where is that energy going to come from? And I think it comes from this post-conventional imperative. It comes from the realization that we need to be different and move into that difference. But to get there, you first of all have to experience it. It has to be a shift in perception, a shift of understanding, a shift of sensibility. And while we can't manufacture that, we can't inject people with the post-conventional view of the world, there is a sense in which by creating a shared space which is a particularly beautiful space, a place where the imagination may be somehow evoked or encouraged, and where we have a chance to taste these things, these flavors of post-tragic, post-rational, post-growth, and post-tribal, that somehow the activities and people that we invite will begin to elicit this sense of the post-conventional imperative, so that we can grow into that somehow. And as Mark will speak to, what comes on the other side, if this is the kind of push, the pull is something more like beauty, imagination, and calling. Once you begin to realize that you have to move beyond the tragic, the rational, the growth imperative, and tribalism, the appetite and openness to beauty, imagination, and calling is all the greater. So that's what that's why I think we're doing the festival in outline. That's how I think it speaks to Bildung, and that's why I'm very happy to pass on to Mark now to speak further about all of this. Thanks for now. And I'll give, if later on, I'm happy to share links to anything that came up here. Bye-bye.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Jonathan. So I'm going to pick up the thread, particularly of beauty, just for a few minutes. And as Jonathan has said, there's this link with Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, and he has actually been described as one of the first British aestheticians, kind of philosophizers, if you like, of beauty, which I mentioned because in a way, he wasn't just an aesthete, as if he went around dressed up in nice clothes. I have no idea whether he did or not, actually. But he felt that beauty is a way of reconnecting with the source of life. It can sort of take the plunge and so revive and refresh us when we're facing the tragic, the rational, the growth, and the tribal in their post forms. You know, if you think about those four things, tragedy has a kind of beauty to it, you know, which the ancient Greeks caught in their plays. And so feeling the quality of that beauty is important to absorbing it and moving beyond. Reason, too, often uses criteria of beauty, like commensurability and so on. But it's become a bit detached from its source, you might say. So moving to the post-rational requires that as well. Growth, too, has often very good aspirations, you know, that people might enjoy life more, but it's somehow become uncoupled from the original kind of beautiful growth, which is the growth of the human soul, you might say. And similarly, tribalism is about feeling safe, which too has a kind of beauty, but can there be a post-tribalism that appeals to a wider connection of all humanity? You can feel the beauty in that phrase. So that's one of the reasons why beauty is not just a nice to have, but is actually about trying to reconnect with something that can lift us to this new place. And the third Earl realized that beauty is a core part of Bildung as well in this broader education, because it requires ourselves, as well as our times and society in which we live, to ask many questions, but one of them is, how are we becoming in a way more beautiful? Trust what beautifies, he said, and it will lead you somewhere. Now, maybe this is a bit preaching to converted, but I wanted to stress that you know, beauty really does work in this way. So, for example, in science, criteria of beauty are used to develop ideas. Goethe, particularly in the German tradition, was very explicit about this when he said that we need to participate in life in order to understand life, and that one of the ways that we can reflect on our participation with the natural world is through criteria like beauty. Even a more rational person like Isaac Newton actually used beauty, the notion of symmetry, the idea that what causes the moon to revolve around the earth is the same thing as what causes the apple to fall from his tree. Seeing the link there requires a kind of inner beauty. So beauty is really key to understand in the scientific domain, and in particular, I think, helps us move beyond a more Baconian, Francis Bacon's idea of education, which is more about measuring, accumulating, building, growth in that other sort of sense. So beauty is important there. It's important, I think, when we're negotiating our economic lives, and in fact, one of the ways that Ashley Cooper's ideas were picked up in the UK, which didn't happen that much, they far more went to the continent, but in the UK was actually in the work of Adam Smith. And he developed in his theory of moral sentiments the idea of a moral compass. and also an impartial spectator, that in a way is like the beauty god looking onto us and asking, is your life beautiful? Can you use that sense, that felt inner sense, to guide you and help assess, discern, judge what you're doing? We need that. It's become rather uncoupled in economics, of course, and his book on economics, the other one, is the one that rather stole the show, certainly in the UK, but it's there, this sense of a moral compass. Of course, you know, we feel it when we feel that things are going wrong in the downside, so can it become part of the upside as well? I just wanted to give a sort of sense of beauty in relation to education as well, because in fact, Ashley Cooper's ideas were picked up by the Romantics, and that was the one bit where they did flourish to some degree in the UK, although again they got rather eclipsed by figures like John Locke, the empiricist tradition, which became much bigger in the UK around utilitarianism and so on. But one of the people who I feel very inspired with, living in South London, he's like my local visionary, if you like, is William Blake. And I have been delighted to discover that Ashley Cooper's ideas about education directly inspired William Blake. And wanted to read a poem, so at least we have some sort of felt sense of beauty in our session in that way, which Blake wrote. It's his famous poem about the schoolboy who feels trapped like a bird in a cage. And he used that image, I think, not just to say how the schoolboy might feel when he's been sent to school to learn by rote, rather than being immersed in nature to learn by his felt sense of connection with the world around him. And also, you know, kind of the beauty that is him discovering himself on his own terms, rather than being forced to discover who he might be because of what is being dumped into him by education by rote. But also because the bird in the cage is kind of a metaphor for, I think, what we can often feel. You know, Blake is this great prophet of our times because he sensed what was coming down the line. And so if I read the poem now, and I'll read it and show Blake's illustration to get the full fourfold vision that Blake wanted us to have when we consider these things, beauty in all its forms, and think about the metaphors and how they speak, but also feel how the vision might inspire us to move into these post forms that Jonathan was speaking about. A little taster anyway. So if I just bring up now that, I hope that will be easy to see now. And let me read it from Blake's illumination and see how it stirs in you and critiques our time, but also invites us to move beyond our time. So I love to rise in a summer morn when the birds sing on every tree. The distant huntsman winds his horn and the skylark sings with me. Oh, what sweet company. But to go to school in a summer morn, oh, it drives all joy away. Under a cruel eye outworn, the little ones spend the day in sighing and dismay. Ah, then at times I drooping sit and spend many an anxious hour, nor in my book can I take delight, nor sit in learning's bower, worn through with the dreary shower. How can the bird that is born for joy sit in a cage and sing? How can a child, when fears annoy but droop its tender wing, and forget his youthful spring? O father and mother, if buds are nipped and blossoms blown away, and if the tender plants are stripped of their joy in the springing day by sorrow and care's dismay, how shall the summer arise in joy, or the summer fruits appear? Or how shall we gather what griefs destroy, or blows the mellowing year when the baths of winter appear? And I think what Blake is inviting us to do is to remember the spring, to remember that we're born for joy, to remember that there can be another way of learning and living in life than being in the anxious hour, that we can sit underneath learning's bower. And Bildung was one of the ways that, of course, the third Earl developed that, and we're trying to pick it up now as well. So something about why beauty is able to connect us with the source, move us through our times now, I hope, but also give birth to something new, into a new spring, you might even say. But Pippa, let me hand over to you now and pick it up in another way.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. My name is Pippa Evans, and I work as a comedian and an improviser in the UK. And I met Jonathan through the spirituality project he was working on at the Royal Society of Arts. And because I started this thing called Sunday Assembly, which is like church for people who don't believe in God. And how did a comedian end up doing that? Well, it's an interesting question, but it was two comedians in a car on the way to a gig talking about what we'd lost by losing God and losing church. And so we created this thing that turned into quite a big phenomenon that went around the world, as we seem to have touched on something that people sensed that they were missing. They were missing this space. And then through that work, I started sort of working with Jonathan and have ended up working with Perspectiva. And on occasions, I've felt like, what are you doing here? And when people ask me, what are you doing? What's this Perspectiva thing? Sometimes I can't really explain it, but I know I need to be here actually, and that I have something to offer through this performance and this improvisation work. And it really speaks to this sort of multiple ways of knowing. There's other work to be done other than the writing and the thinking. The thinking in the sense of the intellectual sense that we know, the writing of papers, etc. This wonderful work that's done, and yet there's something about going beyond the data that is so important. It's so hard to explain and explore because we're so trained, particularly in the UK, I'd say, to separate these two elements, so that there's being clever and knowing stuff, and then there's art. But actually, that we need the art and we need this way of exploring to get through, to expand beyond the intellect. And I think most people actually do feel this, but they're not, we can't articulate it yet. So part of our job is to articulate why this is so important. And I think Bildung does it so brilliantly, but as Jonathan said, doesn't translate so brilliantly in the UK. And so this realization word, for example, in one sense, the UK is really successful as a country. We're rich. Most people have happy lives, there's an abundance of food, and yet we have this sense that there is something not right, that we're not together, that we're fighting. And that's why it's so important that we do this work that finds these other ways of knowing. So one of the reasons the Realisation Festival is at St Giles is because of this historical connection, but also because we understand this really importance of being in nature, and it's surrounded by beautiful grounds. And so what can the nature actually add to this weekend? What can the nature tell us? What is it that we'll go and we'll have a dialogue and a discussion, but then maybe we'll go and sit by the lake or under a beautiful tree that's been there for hundreds of years, and perhaps that tree will give us some different information. Will also speak to the soul quite a lot, actually. And again, for me, there's a word that Jonathan often uses, which is, he says, we need to get beyond our allergies. And I think that's actually also another thing, is this sense of getting beyond, such as the word spiritual, very difficult word for a lot of us, particularly in the UK, where we're very sort of against even sort of talking about religion. It's something not to be spoken about. So how can we start to foster conversations that say perhaps there is something, the post-God world? How do we start to notice that maybe there is something to be brought from that? So during the weekend, we are going to have these workshops, so that we are going to be not just talking, but also being and experiencing. So we are going to work with constellations, and we're going to work with our inner clocks, our inner tempos. Anthea Lawson wants to talk about, her entangled activist, what's the inner life of the activist, what's going on inside whilst we're doing this work. But I'll be talking about improvisation. I would just like to explore improvisation for a moment and why I feel it's so important, because I've been trying to translate it, because I came through improvisation through comedy, improvised musical theatre. But there is something quite amazing about it, which I think speaks to going beyond tribalism, actually, because if I was going to translate the word improvisation for our purposes, I might call it co-creation resilience training, because it's about coming together and having to trust that all of our voices are vital and must be listened to, and yet we must find something else, that we're going to allow something else to emerge. The brilliant jazz scholar Greg Thomas referred to improvisation as aiming for wise spontaneity, which I think is another really brilliant way of framing what we're looking for. So we mustn't confuse improvisation with just making it up as we go along, which is how it's often described, but rather that we are taking the knowledge that we have, the data that we so love to cling on to, and then going into a space where we're not quite sure what will emerge. So that's why I would be an advocate for asking for improvisation to be a vital part of Bildung, actually, and of realization. And one of the really important things about improvisation is listening. And I think listening is something that we just don't pay attention to. And yet the whole realization weekend will be, in a sense, about listening to ourselves, listening to people bringing their expertise, and listening to the surroundings, what they have to tell us. Like Mark's going to do a whole piece about how we respond to the buildings if we stand by this beautiful house that has a history, which perhaps we also have to face. What does that tell us? What do we notice of ourselves? So I just wanted to read this a bit from a beautiful essay that I found by George Lipsitz about improvised listening, and he's talking about jazz improvisation. And I think that's another important thing, is that improvisation is a word in itself, but we often think of it as the skill rather than the act, if that makes sense. So we think of it as comedy improvisation, that's the whole thing. But improvisation in itself is a technique, is a skill that can be learnt, that can be applied onto anything. But so he's talking about jazz improvisation and why he believes jazz, listening like an improviser, is so vital. So he says, in musical life, much can be lost by not listening. Hearing just happens, but listening entails attention and interpretation. Listening is an act of deliberation and discernment, a capacity that gets cultivated through experience. Music is an interactive practice. It is a dialogue, not a monologue. There can be no good players unless there are good listeners. Improvisation plays a crucial role in creating the capacity for an augmented sense of listening, because at its core, improvisation is an art that opens doors. It creates new understandings of previousness and futurity in order to explore hidden possibilities. It privileges temporary and ephemeral resolutions over permanent and set in stone closures, recognizing that yesterday's solutions always require renegotiation and adaptation tomorrow as situations and conditions change. So I think that is delicious. And so that's why I bring this improvisation to Perspectiva. I think one of our challenges, actually, with Bildung, with realization, is to join up all of our thinking, because there's so many brilliant practitioners doing really incredible things that we can. That's why I was quite excited, actually, yesterday at the opening plenary, to see everybody and hear people talking about similar things in different ways, and to find those ways of connecting. So one of our challenges is to actually join up our thinking and to find all the people doing similar work, same work, different ideas, different ways of coming in. And of course, Perspectiva's name says that, the idea is to gather the people doing the work. So what we're really hoping is that realization becomes a place that is a meeting of minds, where we have people bring their wisdom with them. So it's not people being talked at, but people talking with each other and listening to each other. And that's all I have to say about that.
Awesome. Thank you guys. That was brilliant. Just really quickly, what's very active for me right now, or what came up quite strongly just listening to you, Pippa, was Ian McGilchrist's Left Brain, Right Brain, Master and His Emissary, and it seems like we're trying to find ways to express this more right brain way of perceiving and thinking. So yeah, this is now time for a 20-minute or so open discussion with everybody. One thing I quickly want to give some time for is for one of you guys or all of you guys to address the word realization and how it relates to Bildung, because I think that's quite important to bring up.
I'm happy to do that if you guys are okay with that. So first of all, Nicholas, yeah, just to say, Ian McGilchrist is kind of an associate of Perspectiva, and although I don't bring him in that much because you have to have contended with his sort of significant corpus of a book to make sense of how it works. But you're quite right to discern that actually there is something about, we call it a festival of learning and unlearning, or unlearning and learning. I forget which way I'm putting it. But or actually, sorry, excuse me. We came to the decision to call it a festival of unlearning and reimagining. Is that right? I think that's right. Yeah, and that took a little bit of time to figure out. But the unlearning aspect of that is a little bit about what, in McGilchrist terms, the kind of loosening the hold of the left hemisphere. It's not to destroy it, which is again why when I say post all these things, we're not severing those connections, but we're just trying to loosen them enough that other forms of perception and imagination can come into the picture. And in terms of realization, right? So there's three ways of looking at this. The word realization has three main aspects that are all Bildung in some sense. So the first is just the kind of to realize something in the conventional sense of becoming aware of something. I realized that I was tired. I realized that we're going to have to change direction. I realized that this is not going to work. So the first sort of meaning of realization in the context of the festival is the kind of coming to attention, sort of noticing, attending, waking up to something in a sense. That's the first meaning of it, to realize something, to become aware of it. The second meaning is sort of a bit richer philosophically, and that's more like something to do with eudaimonia in an Aristotelian sense, that the sort of self-realized individual, the process of realization, something like entelechy, maybe the idea of sort of becoming who you're meant to be, the process of realization, growing into the best version of yourself somehow. So the second meaning is, and this is I think closest to Bildung, is this sort of developmental notion of realization as this progressive unfolding of the self, developing into more and more mature, sophisticated, capable versions of itself. And the final meaning of realization in this context is something to do with making manifest in the world, to realize a dream, to realize your ambition to create your own cafe or whatever, to realize the idea you had to build that new institute or school, for something to be realized as opposed to merely conceived. So there's a kind of becoming aware, self-fulfillment or maybe flourishing, and then there's the kind of making manifest in the world. And we think all of these things are grounded in Bildung. And we also think it's refreshing to speak of it as realization, because the first meaning, and to some extent all of them, but especially the first one, for those who don't know Bildung, it can be a bit of a learning curve to get into it. When you sort of start saying the primary challenge of the world is somehow a challenge of transformative civic education, or it's something to do with we have to learn adult education, or we have to learn. People are like, yeah, they kind of get it, but they don't really. And what we were speaking about at the festival and Mark certainly speaks to this more clearly than I can, but there's something about a fundamental shift of perception that takes place where you kind of realize this is not just tacking on a bit of education to an existing edifice. This is a transformation of the entire raison d'etre of society as a whole. So in the essay that I wrote on Bildung, and I think Zach Stein spoke to Comenius yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, but Comenius has language where he speaks about, I probably got the Latin mispronounced, but subspecia economicus, under the aspect of economics. That's what we're living now. We're living under the aspect of economics. Society is driven by and for the economy. And we need to get to subspecia educationis, or whatever that is. And again, don't quote my Latin as authority. But it's to do with getting society under the aspect of education, which is a global system driven by the human desire to grow as people, as in perception, in our sense of beauty, in our capacity to love and care and so forth. Why do I mention that in the context of realization? Because I think the term realization actually elicits that sense of gestalt shift or metanoia or conversion, maybe more than Bildung itself does. But it is there philosophically, as Mark can maybe say. It's not like it's a new idea. It's just that we think the term helps to elicit that sense of shift and transformation rather than just programmatic education.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I think about it is in Comenius's idea that there's a kind of horizontal education, but there's also a vertical education. So there's the kind of building on that takes place in what you might call chronos time, like clock time. You put the days and weeks into going to school. But what you really want are the moments of interruption when you go, oh my goodness, I never thought of that before, because that's what really changes you. And that can be hard because it requires tension, even breakdown actually at times. And crisis and all those kind of things. So you need the kind of chronological idea of education to hold you in some sort of space that can allow for these breakthroughs that might also feel quite like breakdowns. And it's one of the reasons why I love improvisation, because when I went on Pippa's improvisation workshops, I kind of felt that's what was going on. That you go for the workshop, you go for the weekend, but there's a kind of tension because you're going to have you fall into those moments of why spontaneity, if you're lucky, and you think, is it going to happen, and so on. But it does actually, when you've got the sort of the two elements going together. So yeah, realization captures some of that for me as well.
Cool. Pippa, do you have anything to add?
No.